Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on building world-class APIs and generating a sustainable API strategy. I am joined today by Kevin Swiber, API strategy lead for Postman. And I want to thank everyone for joining. So before we get started, I wanted to cover a couple of just logistical things. So here in our Livestorm webinar platform interface, you see we have like the chat window, and it looks like some people are posting messages in there. There's also a question tab where you can post questions throughout the webinar, and we'll pause every once in a while to answer questions. And it's important to get your questions in there so it's easier to find them when we look at them, look for questions that tee up to Kevin. And it also gives an opportunity for other attendees to upvote your questions. So we'll also be looking at the most upvoted questions and try to address those first. So it looks like a lot of folks saying hello and good morning. Do you mind typing in where you are watching this from? Love to hear that. Usually we get a great global audience, so it's always fun to see where people are from. So Nairobi, Russia, LA, Philippines, folks in the US. So this is great. Another great global turnout. So thank you everyone for joining. So, before we get started, if you are unfamiliar with who Educative is and what we do, we have over 600 courses and available for a free trial where you can code directly in the browser so you can start learning within seconds on the latest in programming, system design, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data science. And especially in relation to today's call around APIs, we've got some great courses on developing web apps and also testing web APIs, as well as preparing for the API design interview, which is an increasingly common type of interview for folks who are interviewing for coding jobs. And especially in relation to Postman, we've got a great course on testing React applications with Postman. And also just like great guidance on building and designing great web APIs. So I encourage you to check that out. It's at educative.io/trial. And all the attendees in today's call will also have the opportunity to get to win a free personal subscription to Educative by signing up for a free trial, or getting a free team subscription for you and your coworkers at work to both learn and introduce. We've got some great workflow features in our enterprise product at Educative, and there'll be more on that over the next coming weeks. So, with that out of the way, I want to introduce Kevin. So, he's a senior API strategy lead at Postman, as I mentioned. He's also a technical evangelist, and he specializes in enterprise architecture and API lifecycle management. So, he consults with a lot of the top companies on helping them design and build their APIs. And in today's talk, Kevin's going to be covering a couple different topics. One is like fundamentals of web API management. So this is going beyond just the nuts and bolts of building an API and consuming an API, but how do you actually build something that's going to be used by, say, multiple different groups, different teams, and it needs to be, what's the long tail, and how do you make this a web API that's going to last for multiple years down the road? And so, leading into that is taking a product approach to web APIs. And then also, how do you build APIs that scaled for traffic and for high throughput as well? And then, he's got some fun stories on horror and transformation tales of, API stories and API initiatives that have gone wrong, and then, but more importantly, how they were transformed and became successful. So again, reminder, please add your questions in the question tab, and we will have live Q&A throughout the discussion. And a recording of this webinar will be shared with everyone via email after today's event, as well as instructions on how to qualify for our free giveaways for the free personal subscription as well as a team subscription. All right. So with that out of the way, let me hand it off to Kevin and to talk about the fundamentals of web API management.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate being here. And this is, a topic that I love to talk about. Um, I've been in the API space for over a decade now. I've worked with hundreds of companies on their API transformations and their digital strategies. And it's been great to work at kind of the low level of API design influence, all the way up to, what is our strategy for implementing APIs across the company. And one of the really interesting things that happened is, when I started working for a company called Apogee in 2012, and they're an API management company. Um, in 2012, we were talking to folks about the business benefits of API, saying, like, this is more than just an integration point. This is actually an opportunity for you to have another channel of revenue. Um, and it was, at the time, kind of a difficult sell for a lot of folks. And we were kind of a technology company talking to business folks about enabling their enterprise IT. If we fast forward all the way to today, to 2023, now the folks I'm talking to, the companies I'm talking to, they're saying we have so many APIs, we don't know what to do with them. They're dealing with massive API sprawl. And so we start to look at how do we gain some efficiencies in the way we approach APIs. And for me, this takes us back to the API lifecycle. Now, when we talk about API lifecycle, we're really talking about, like, how do APIs flow through our software development lifecycle within our organization. When we often think about producing software, we usually are looking at kind of the producer lifecycle side of this diagram. Where Postman comes in, and kind of the advantage that we've had, is that Postman started life as an API client. And that has kind of given us access to this whole workflow that we take when we're building APIs, when we're consuming APIs. Um, and so that consumer life cycle, as it turns out, is super important. So one of the things I like to point out in this diagram, Steve, is that yeah, there are plenty of phases to both the producer and the consumer life cycle. But what's really significant here is where they come together, like where you start distributing those APIs in a way that they can be discovered. And what happens once an API is out there? What kind of feedback are we getting from our consumers to help improve our APIs going forward?
Thanks, Evan. And when you talk with folks and talking about this API lifecycle, this is equally applicable to folks and companies, say like Salesforce and big B2B companies that are exposing public APIs, like Reddit. Well, Reddit stopped, or they're charging a lot of money. That's a good example. But this is also equally applicable to companies like enterprises who are sharing APIs for internal consumption. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I usually segment three sorts of APIs, and sometimes it's a little foggy which is which, but usually we'll say there are private APIs that are used internally. There are partner APIs that are used with some kind of white glove treatment with partnerships that you're establishing. And then there are public APIs that sort of have a whole public consumption motion associated with them. Now, even most public APIs are kind of partner APIs, and sometimes you get into situations where private APIs graduate into partner APIs, and so sometimes the lines are a little bit blurred. But in each of these cases, we should be caring about the consumers. We should be caring about our distribution mechanisms and how we get that information out. And these efficiencies, can be seen as just sort of internal efficiencies that we're building for private APIs, but they can also be, good user facing or consumer facing um, product level efficiencies and improvements that we can get, right? Like looking at things like time to first call. How long does it take me to make my first API call? That's going to be important whether it's a private API, a partner API, or a public API.
Got it. Okay. Thanks. And so let's talk a little bit about this, this notion of talking about APIs as a platform. And there's lots of little boxes and different categories here. So can you walk us through this?
Yeah, so there are plenty of companies out there, and I've worked with plenty of companies. I've been guilty of saying, "Hey, our product is the API platform," and you can come and set up our product, and ta-da, you've got everything you need. Um, the reality is that when folks are positioning themselves as an API platform, and Postman does this too, we position ourselves as an API platform. The reality is there's a lot more that needs to connect into that to give yourself a platform that is going to actually integrate to your environment. Um, when we talk about vendors like Postman is probably never going to come out with a CI/CD pipeline solution, right? Probably never going to come out with a source control management solution. Um, you know, isn't going to get into a lot of the cloud infrastructure that we have today. It's not our business and where our value is. Even sort of APM type tools, right? There's this much larger ecosystem out there that all needs to be pulled together to deliver this experience for your API consumers. Um, so we're seeing a lot of interest in internal developer platforms now. Backstage is getting a lot of press and some usage there. These folks are kind of along the same lines and kind of getting the same idea, right? Like they allow customization so you can plug in everything you need to try to build this internal platform. And I think we'll see that space continue to expand as folks try to solve these problems.
Got it. So if you can maybe step through, do you mind like kind of walking through these different categories? So like I think people, especially new to API development, are thinking, okay, source code, build the API endpoint, no brainer. But it looks like there are a whole bunch of other considerations in creating a like truly a robust API. So can you talk about like these individual components of like the platform, the gateways, APM, and things like that?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm going to start on the specifications box that we have at the bottom here. I've been affiliated with the Open API initiative for quite some time, so I know these folks fairly well, and Open API as a thing. So Open API is a contract. It's a specification. It's a way to really identify the structure of how your RESTful API might look, including the shape of your requests and your responses. We see a lot of people move towards a design first approach these days. And to do that, they're often using Open API to kind of model the API before actually building it out. And so that's got to live somewhere, right? That needs some kind of source of truth and some way to collaborate around that. Typically, like we'll see that live in, say, both Postman, but also connected to your source control system. So maybe it's checked into GitHub, and now your specification in GitHub has a link to the specification in Postman, which is going to open up a more collaborative platform that might extend beyond, say, just your developer audience. And so all these connections need to be made. Once we start actually building things out, um, we'll build some tests in Postman, say, along with our actual implementation of the API. We'll want to see those tests get executed every time we check in code, every time we commit and push code. And that's where our CI/CD pipelines are going to come in. So if that's Jenkins or Circle CI, GitHub Actions, Travis CI, whatever you might be using. We want to run that on a fairly continuous basis, right? So not only on sort of each push, in the continuous integration sense, but also in the continuous delivery or continuous deployment sense. If I'm deploying to staging, for instance, I might have a regression suite that I want to run at that point. All this has to sort of like come into play in order to make sure that we're delivering high quality software. And once we're out there, we need to have protections against our API. And so a lot of times we'll do authorization, for instance, through a gateway that might be out there. So that might be Apigee, as I mentioned. It might be Azure API management, could be AWS API gateway. Not just authorization and access control, but also things like traffic shaping, rate limiting, quota management, that sort of thing. And sometimes that ties into pricing and monetization products as well. And of course, on the operations side, we always need to make sure that we're actually up and running, right? So our APM solutions out there will start alerting us, or at least keep track of performance over time. Let us know, are we hitting like a bunch of 500 errors? Are we seeing anomalous behavior happen in our API traffic? So all of this really has to come together to build this huge machine of people and process and technology that's going to deliver our API platform.
Got it. So I guess one question I have for the audience is, and then also, please, if you have questions for Kevin, please put them in the question section. How many of you are, maybe in the comments, are actually, utilizing and some components of this API platform that Kevin is describing. So, thinking around like testing automation, continuous delivery, APM, and different clouds and gateways. Or most of you and companies that you work with, are they focused you perhaps a little bit earlier in the maturity cycle and thinking primarily in terms of just getting the endpoints out there and just getting like an API exposed and thinking about it from a code perspective first. Okay.
Yeah, so seeing some interesting things here. Jenkins, yeah, Jenkins will never die. Jenkins will be around forever. Even with folks who have like moved on to different CI/CD platforms, there's still like some Jenkins server running in the
Mhm.
corner there, right? And I love Jenkins; it's great, and they're doing improvements all the time. I see Grafana there for sort of visualizing dashboards. Fantastic tool. PagerDuty for alerts. Yeah, that's good. And someone mentioned Pactflow up here somewhere too. Yeah, so Pactflow is interesting in terms of doing contract testing. So, I mentioned OpenAPI as a way to define the shape of your API. Pactflow can use OpenAPI, but uses other things as well to try to say, here's a contract that the consumer expects, and here's a contract that the producer is expecting to produce. And then being able to say, like, hey, do these contracts match? Before releasing any code, to try to detect any breaking changes before they're released. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Newman runs Postman collections and tests. Yeah, a lot of good stuff
Got
here.
it. Okay. So let's. One question I have is like, especially on the spec side, is that are we still seeing that like REST, a REST protocol is still the predominant protocol? I've seen GraphQL try to kind of like personally, this is just my personal assessment. I've seen GraphQL trying to like bump into mainstream, but it still hasn't quite gotten quite there. So I'd love to get a sense of like what you're seeing in the industry.
Yeah, like many competing technologies, we see a lot of published articles out there that are doing battle, right? They're like REST versus GraphQL, versus gRPC. Um, And I think like the reality is that gets a lot of viewers, that gets a lot of attention, that gets a lot of people reading your article. But like when you hit the ground floor, these things are often solving different problems in a different ways. So it's very rare that I go into a business now and see that they're only doing one of these technologies, right? Because of the prevalence of RESTful APIs, they're in just about every account that I have. But I also still have SOAP APIs that come up, right? And for a lot of people, they wish SOAP would go away. But it's been around for a long time, and it's still there. Almost everyone right now has at least one GraphQL experiment, or they have bitten off a little bit more, and they've said, okay, this is more than experiment. Let's migrate some of our APIs over to GraphQL. Um, gRPC, I see less of, except in the tech sector. A lot of tech sector folks are moving towards gRPC, and Microsoft in particular is making some movements in their stack to promote gRPC more. So I expect to see gRPC go up just by way of Microsoft's promotion of it going forward.
Okay, great. And I've got one question here from Kelvin. And are there any emerging trends or technologies in the web API space that you feel like developers should be aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question. I there is a lot out there, and it gets pretty overwhelming sometimes to figure out like what should I invest in as a developer. Um, I think if you're kind of just getting into APIs, learning about Open API is great. There's a lot of tooling that can get generated off of Open API. Documentation can come off of Open API. It has tons of different use cases, and we're looking at doing a new major version of Open API right now. So if you are into Open API already, getting involved with that community and helping to determine the future of that would be helpful. Um, I think we've seen a big boom in EDA, event driven architecture as well, and so that's I like to think of them still as APIs, although some people would disagree with that. And so, looking at some event-driven architecture stuff might be interesting as well. There's an async API that's kind of the async equivalent to Open API, where you get to describe your channels and your messages and things like that. So definitely take a look at what's out there. Back when I was an enterprise architect, I led both SOA, so service-oriented architecture initiatives, and EDA, event-driven architecture initiatives. And there's going to be a place for both of these going forward. So I would say a good place to kind of start right now is looking at these ecosystems around Open API and Async API, and then kind of finding your way into communities from there.
Okay. And where can people find out more about Open API?
Open APIs, plural.org. And then Async API is at asyncapi.com.
Okay, fantastic. Cool. All right. We got a couple more questions, but why don't we keep, in the interest of time, why don't we keep moving along, and then we can come back to some of them. But I encourage folks to keep asking your questions, and I see that there is a lively chat discussion as well. Pretty entertaining, and I think someone commented on me being a model. Very flattering, but no, I've maybe the bar is lower if I'm a tech model. But back to you, Kevin. So, like, if we wanted to sum up this section on thinking of web APIs as a platform, what do we want to leave people with?
Yeah, so when I talk about life cycle and I talk about platform, like these are kind of big terms, but it really all boils down to this combination of people and process and technology. I've definitely worked at places in my past where we thought we could just bring in technology solutions, and then everything would be taken care of. But the reality was our processes had changed to accommodate that technology. We didn't have the right people in the room, even helping us make decisions or informing what those decisions should be. So I always say that this change takes a combination of people and process and technology. And so getting all the right people in the room, not just the people who make decisions, but the people who are going to be impacted by those decisions, getting the process together. So what are we actually doing today? And where can we find efficiencies? And then what technologies can help support those people doing those processes to gain the efficiencies that we're looking for. It's not always obvious. So, typically we talk about making maps of all this stuff, and having real conversations that are sometimes difficult. Um, and across all of this, there are kind of three areas that I always look at when looking at any kind of life cycle, and that's productivity, quality, and governance. Right, productivity is going to be one of those efficiencies that we're looking for, but we want to know like how are we gaining efficiencies while maintaining a high level of quality. And when we answer that question, like how we're gaining those efficiencies while maintaining quality, what governance can we put in place to make sure it stays that way, to make sure that we're preventing drift along the way, right? So let's come up with a set of rules that we're going to follow to increase our productivity and quality, and then let's make sure that that's being adhered to, and that we have compliance with that as we move forward.
Okay. So one last question. So I've heard, like, especially when talking, like, in enterprise architecture discussions and things like that, the notion of governance. And I've, for me personally, it's always been, it's been kind of like a vague topic. But can you talk a little bit about like what your definition of governance is, and how people, and what it entails?
Yeah. Governance, unfortunately, is surrounded by words that often give people like a bad sort of knee jerk reaction, makes them like wince in pain, thinking of bad experiences they've had in the past. Um, and then you start to bring in like legislative sounding words, which are almost cold, right? Like you talk about compliance, you talk about policies, you talk about rules, and it, like some folks, they start to drift away and say, okay, this isn't my area of expertise at all. It's not something I care about. Governance is really about, um, not so much the policies that are being put in place, but what those policies enable. So the opposite of I should say, the other side of the governance coin is enablement. And when I talk to teams who are being impacted by governance, I always talk in terms of enablement. So, are we putting rules in place that say, every API needs to have an authentication mechanism associated with it? Great. Like, what is that actually doing for us? Is it just giving me more work to input or to add an authentication mechanism? No, actually, it's enabling us to have secure communications and to be a bit more relaxed in our knowledge of the API traffic that we're getting, to feel a little bit more secure in what we're doing, right? Um, so it's definitely sort of cause and effect. A lot of folks tend to talk about the cause and not really look at the effect. And I think we've seen that there's been a huge change. Just to go off on another tangent, unfortunately, but just we've seen like a huge change in org structure over the years. So there used to be governance teams or like enterprise architecture teams that were kind of pushing this stuff down from ivory towers. Since then, we've seen a big transformation into having many stream-aligned teams that are cross-functional. And so now when we talk about governance, we're often talking about kind of a federated model where we've got representatives from each of these stream-aligned teams, sometimes working with a platform team that are trying to come up with solutions together. And so instead of being top down, it's much more democratic.
Okay, cool. Appreciate that. So let's move on to the second topic of taking a product approach to web APIs. So walk us through this lifecycle map that that you're sharing with us.
Yeah, so this is an exercise I do with customers sometimes, and um, the goal here really is to figure out what are we actually doing today, or what is the end state we'd like to be in, right? I mentioned like a combination of people and process and technology, and so we have that kind of laid out in a map here. Um, each phase might differ depending on your organization and how you define phases. These are some phases that we use, but it's helpful to go through and say, like, who's the owner of this particular phase and what steps are we actually doing. You'll see little icons for technology. There's like Postman there, there's like AWS Lambda there, and AWS API Gateway and GitHub, just sort of labeling, tagging each of these steps, like here's the technology that's being used along the way. This kind of visibility gives you lots of great insight into where we can reduce rework that might be happening in our process, where we can reduce redundancies, how we can sort of manage efficiencies moving forward. Right? We can. This makes it very clear if we have a lot of back and forth between two different phases or two different actors within our life cycle. And again, kind of enables those efficiencies to come into play. And we may even get to places where we say, okay, we know we need like a phase for distribute. But right now, the way we notify people that we have a new API is we send an email out or we tell them over Slack or something like that. And that gives you the opportunity to say, could we do this better? Could we add some more technology here that would be more of an API catalog that perhaps alerts people when new versions are released, that sort of thing.
Got it. Okay, so we got a couple of questions flowing in, but I wanted to start off with one question that comes to mind for me is that, I think obviously like this life cycle map makes sense and is absolutely necessary for, like larger implementations and mature organizations and larger teams. But I guess like how strictly, how do you strike the right balance with like, velocity and like experimentation, especially for, people and teams who are just starting out or say like a startup trying to be agile, do you feel like you introduce elements of this life cycle like later on down the road, or do you feel like it's super important to kind of like adhere to this in the beginning, and you might might be at the risk of like some velocity, but you're saving yourself some pain down the road.
Well, I mean, I think even if you're a team of three, it's important to kind of lay out what your process is. And anyone who's ever worked with compliance knows that there's always like an exception route that needs to get defined as well. Because there are always issues that pop up that are going to be, how do I do a hot fix? What happens when there's an emergency? What happens when I get like dinged because there's some legislation that says I'm not meeting a regulation, right? Like, there's always some exception process that needs to happen. But I think even as a team of three, it's helpful to map that out. One thing that sort of early agile stuff kind of taught us is that we feel a little bit less married to the artifacts we produce, like this lifecycle map, if we draw them out by hand, right? So even just doing this on a whiteboard where you can easily kind of erase and change it with something else can be a good exercise to do, particularly when it's smaller. Having something like this diagram to send out is great when you're bigger and you need to communicate across a larger organization. But it doesn't have to be this sophisticated looking. It could be something as simple as boxes and arrows that you draw on a whiteboard and talk about.
Okay, got it. Um, all right, let me take a question here from, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, but from Laquia. And their question is, with the rise of serverless architectures and microservices, how do you envision APIs evolving to accommodate these different architectures? Are there any best practices or patterns emerging in this space?
Yeah, so this is interesting. Like the when we talk about serverless in particular, we start really getting into what's being commodified right now, what's becoming more of a utility, and we see API gateways kind of going that way as well. The biggest sign that something's becoming a utility, and utility for us in the computing space is typically means that the AWSs of the world or the Azures or the GCPs of the world are starting to productize this stuff. Um, I think once we start looking at that, we can start calculating things as utilities and saying, like, can we take advantage of the pricing models that are associated with this? And that might have an impact on our architecture, right? So we've actually seen some folks take Lambda as a model and say, actually, it's easier for me to do like an EDA, like an event driven sort of thing with that. And they go the Lambda route. You can now like directly stand up an API endpoint on top of your Lambda. So we start to see that coming back around, right? With folks using sort of synchronous APIs there. Um, and what's not really mentioned here, you mentioned microservices, but kind of the explosion of Kubernetes and container environments as well. The the thing that we need the most as we become more distributed is observability tooling around all of that. So we need to know what actually is happening. We need tracing involved. The ability to trace a call through your system and understand what's happening is so critical to knowing the reality out there, right? Like the more complex our architecture becomes, the more difficult it is to understand what's actually happening. And these observability tools get us closer to that. We don't want to be lost in debugging. And so I always say, think about debugging even when you're designing your API, right? Like you're going to be looking at this later when it's in production, and you need to figure out what's going on. Will you be able to tell what's going on? That's an important thing to consider.
Got it. Okay. And I think I've seen two questions around a similar topic. Uh, but I'll highlight BK's question here is that, as far as like this product lifecycle or API platform, or even just like, managing APIs themselves, have you seen or are we observing any signs that, we're looking at AI enabled web APIs in the near future?
Yeah, so there are kind of two sides to this. There are, can I plug in my API to something like ChatGPT? And then there's, can I use ChatGPT to generate my API or to help me generate my API, right? And ChatGPT has plugins now, which are looking really great that I've prototyped with a little bit, where you can, have it go check your API for, flight reservations and things like that, flight availability, and bring back that sort of live data. On the generative AI side, we're seeing people say, hey, let me describe the kind of API I want. And ChatGPT will output an open API definition that they can go put into their systems. We're experimenting with AI in Postman actually in sort of test script generation. So you can hit the request button, get the response back, and tell Postbot, we call it, hey, can you generate some tests for me around this? And it'll look at your response and say, yeah, I think you want to check for these fields and sort of this kind of schema. So we're definitely seeing a lot of movement around this, and it's still very early stages, but I think it'll continue to evolve.
Okay, interesting. And then like this postbot, is that something that's in an open beta right now?
Yes, yeah, I believe it is in an open beta. It might be alpha even, but it's open. Uh, so it's definitely out there. And we have a number of different vendors that we're working with on the back end for this as well. And we're looking to get better at it all the time, right? Test script generation is a very common thing that we've heard a lot about. So.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Um, so let's talk about like like the API consumer side and what's valuable to them. So can you walk us through this?
Yeah, so the whole kind of idea here is that we're treating our APIs like a product. Um, and that means a bunch of different things. Uh, but for folks with the kind of traditional API mindset, it takes a little bit of a shift and thinking like this is not just a technology that I'm producing, but there's another human at the end of this who is going to go and consume this API. And what is the experience like for them? So getting like your API lifecycle together is great, but don't forget that consumer side as well. Like the API lifecycle map we looked at was mostly just on the producer end, but what about that API consumer end as well? This is where like traditional product management lessons tend to come in. Where we might traditionally be looking at a web-based product or a SaaS product, and doing things like user journey mapping, doing things like customer satisfaction surveys. All that stuff actually becomes meaningful for your API consumers as well. There are certain analytics that you can put in place to try to figure out what is that time to first call. Um, and we focus on that a lot. So, how long does it take you to make the first API call? Usually, with authorization being the most difficult hurdle to get through for a lot of folks. But there are more metrics that have impact than that. And that's the time to first meaningful integration. So I made my first API call, cool, but this isn't just about making an API call. It's about actually creating some integration with that, getting some value from that API. So great, I got my code wired up, right? That's another sort of metric. Um, Great, I have my code deployed and it's actually producing value for people, right? Like how long to go from, hey, this is an API I could use, to, hey, I'm actually getting value from this API. And then, of course, the developer satisfaction along the way is something worth paying attention to. And some of this data is quantitative, some of it is qualitative. That's if you've worked with product managers, that's the world they live in. Dealing with both quantitative and qualitative metrics. But all this stuff becomes really super important to build better APIs, to build more effective APIs for our consumers. So really taking that product mindset and checking on those API consumers and not thinking of them as just sort of faceless entities that are consuming an API, but there's a real developer at the end of that API that's going to need your help.
Got it. Okay, cool. So why don't we keep going and talking about like how does how do you actually measure success of your API platform?
Yeah, so once you're like really involved in this and you're taking this product mindset and you're getting serious about your API lifecycle, you start to notice that like an API platform is emerging, and you probably already today have elements of this. You've got an authorization system in place. You've got maybe an identity provider in place. You have elements of an API platform that are growing. What's helpful is to sort of admit that and acknowledge that and start to track some of that, and build a solid initiative around that. Because we find if there aren't solid initiatives around things like API platforms and landscape, they tend to just get defined by sub teams and redefined by other teams, and there becomes a communication issue and a duplication issue. We end up duplicating work. So it's important to kind of notice those signs, and then try to get that buy-in, internally to start focusing on, do we have an API platform team? Is it made up of folks who are representative of our different stream-aligned teams as well? Let's start talking about what governance means to us, and where it's important, those kind of conversations. So like we often see them start to emerge, but just try to notice them actually happening, and give support to those folks who are pushing for them internally.
Okay, cool. And so, staying on this, the final slide on this topic around like taking this product approach to web APIs. So, there's this notion of like, this API maturity. So, what are some of the concepts that that should be important for developers to pick up from here?
Yeah, and again, this kind of comes from kind of taking a product mindset to this. Do you have a maturity based model? Like, are you seeing your private APIs start to get interest from folks who might want to consume them from a partner level? Do we see that move into more of a public facing API as well? What is the approach to take there? What is the I guess the distribution model that we're taking? And then not just the organic growth that happens in sort of modeling that, but being more proactive about it, more prescriptive. Do we want to have an alpha, a beta? Do we want to have a big GA moment? What's our press release going on around that? Really, like keeping in mind this model of promoting APIs to eventually reach that end consumer that you have.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. All right. So let's move on to our next topic around building web APIs at scale. I see a few questions coming in, but in the interest of time, let's hold off on, I'll please keep asking them, but we'll hold off trying to answer them towards the end because I want to make sure that we cover all of these topics. So not only this topic, but one which I think is going to be the most fun topic, which is like the horror and transformation stories. So why don't we keep moving along and let's talk about some of these concepts around building web APIs that scale.
Yeah, when we talk about scaling web APIs, like we're not just talking about scaling the infrastructure for them, right? Because as we get even more usage of our API, it's not only that infrastructure that needs to scale, but remember, it's the people, the process, and the technology. So really, everything needs to scale along with it. And one of the first things we start to run into is, something like security. Why is security something that's only thought about before we release to production? Is this something that we can catch early on? And it is, right? We can model our security mechanism in our open API definitions. And if we're starting with an open API definition, we can have CI/CD in place that says, actually, like this hasn't even been defined. And sometimes that's enough of a warning signal to us to say, like, oh no, we forgot this. If you're actually designing your open API first, in something like Postman or other tools, you'll get warnings, that says, "Hey, you need security defined in this open API." And so these little reminders to us that we need to start thinking about production level things as soon as we start thinking about design.
Okay. And then, some people, hopefully most folks are aware of the concept or familiar with the concept of shift left. But for those who may not be, can you describe what that concept means?
Yeah, so we see this term shift left. It's a buzzword. We see it around security. We see it around testing. And, I suppose it thinks of like a linear path of your software development lifecycle and things that you typically wait for at the end. I guess if it's going left to right, things that you typically wait for at the right side of that, start pushing them over to the left. Start thinking about security earlier. Start thinking about testing earlier. An example is performance testing that a lot of people don't think about until they're ready to deploy. What are my performance requirements for this? What is the acceptable latency that my consumers will experience before it's detrimental to them? And then even on the protective side, like what can we handle? Like what should our rate limiting be? What should our are we using quotas? These operational level concerns, they impact even the design of your API. So the sooner we start thinking about that and realizing that we have complex models of consumers that we need to account for, the easier it's going to be to not run into these problems in production, to catch them early, to account for them early, and to put in the right debugging tools that we need, the right tracing tools that we need to monitor it and track it along the way.
Okay. So, I mean, these are things that are, say, controllable by the developer and the dev team, but it seems like there are some things that can't be controlled that you still have to account for. Like specifically like the network itself. So, can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, especially once we start getting into these complex, distributed architectures internally, where we've got services calling services calling services calling services, we don't want to take ourselves down internally as well, right? Um, and we have to keep in the back of our minds constantly that the network is completely unreliable. The network might go down, even in my own VPC, in my cloud provider. Um, the network might go down, right? We see it happen all the time, even just little blips in the network. Um, so what do we do with that, right? Do we just drop the call that happens and propagate errors back? Well, we have a couple of options to try to make this seamless. Automatic recovery is huge, right? So, are we doing retries on our API calls? Do we have some kind of exponential back off there, so we're not just hitting it constantly, and creating more load that might potentially take down the server even longer, right? Um, so exponential backoff is one of those. A circuit breaker pattern. So are we seeing that this site is, or that this endpoint is definitely down, and it's absolutely down? Great. Let's just flip the switch, call it down, and not try to hit it for some period of time and return errors, right? Because again, we don't necessarily want to overload a server that's trying to come back up. You can get into this scenario where the server goes down, and as soon as it comes back up, it has a thundering herd that takes it down again, and it's just a cycle that never ends. So circuit breaker helps there. And with a bulkhead pattern, we're saying like when something breaks, let's take down this whole block that's broken altogether, and we'll isolate sort of the failure to this entire block. So there's a bunch of different patterns like this, to help you on the technical side. But it's important to know that there are, I think, 8 fallacies of distributed computing. Those are good to look up. The network absolutely cannot be trusted. And it really is where we got into trouble with kind of early network RPC technologies that tried to abstract the network entirely. Modern RPC technologies aren't quite so bad. So, like gRPC kind of acknowledges there's a network there. But early RPC technologies, tried to make things fail transparently. And so much can happen over the network that it's really difficult to abstract that to something that looks like it's natural in your programming environment without acknowledging the network. So, um, don't be afraid to acknowledge the network in your code. You're going to have to deal with it, no matter really what technology you pick. That's talking over the network.
Got it. And where can people find out more about like the circuit breaker and bulkhead pattern? Should they just Google it, or is there like a book that kind of goes into this in depth?
Yeah, so there are a few books. Release It is the name of a book that goes into this and into some depth.
Hmm.
Microsoft has a bunch of information on different network patterns, including all of these.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would Bing it for Microsoft
Right. And I
or
see
Google
that
it with Bing.
Sumit posted a link to the circuit breaker pattern on the Azure docs. So thank you very much, Sumit, in the chat.
There you go. Yeah, they have a whole architecture section. Yeah, they have a whole architecture section that's really good. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So for the most anticipated, or what I was looking forward to most in today's discussion are the horror and transformation stories from what you've observed, Kevin. So I'd love to hear like the lessons learned and some of the experiences that you've seen.
Yeah, let me start with the transformation because I think we can talk about the horror ones for a while that are still kind of ongoing. Um, but a very common, and I'll try to keep it anonymous because I don't want to shame anybody, um, and also because like this might resonate true for your org as well, and so maybe the shame won't help. Um, but I was working with a large financial provider, and they were in this situation of API sprawl, right? Like I mentioned, we've moved to these stream-aligned teams. We've got stream-aligned teams making microservices. We somewhere along the way lost the idea of a platform team, and so each stream-aligned team is essentially building their own platform along the way. And eventually they noticed this API sprawl was a problem, and they also noticed they had no visibility into how bad the problem was. So we gave them some advice on how to get some visibility into what APIs are out there. And when they came back, they were incredibly surprised to find that for address verification alone, they had 7 different APIs that were handling address verification. And now, this isn't just like an API that I'm building that's talking to some internal system. These are APIs that have like external partners that are backing this information. And like we've got multiple agreements with multiple partners to do address verification, right? And so it's not just a waste of developer resources, but it's a waste of sort of our biz dev resources. It's a waste of money that we're spending on multiple vendors here. Um, Now, the good news for them is that they were able to identify this, and they weren't able to narrow it down to just 3 different APIs for address verification. But it took that sort of visibility, getting that visibility first, and understanding how much money was sort of like going down the drain before they could really make those steps. And so, like we talked about the API lifecycle and doing a lifecycle map, and we talked about that sort of discover, distribute part of the lifecycle. They've significantly increased their visibility there. And now it's a lot easier for them to say, oh, we have 7 of the same thing. Granted, they still have 3. I don't know all the reasons why they still have 3 address verification APIs, but maybe it's because of those vendor relationships and previous agreements. I'm not sure.
Okay. That's a good one. Do you have any others?
Yeah, let me think. Some of them are so specific that like you would know exactly who it is, and I think it's not not right. I did want to talk about like some I did want to talk about some horror stories that we're seeing play out very publicly right now. I think the most recent, the most relevant is probably Reddit.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating is to watch, what happens to like a business who's monetizing a product in a certain way that has a free tier for API access, right? Like and I think this unfortunately is going to be a trend, right? Similar to the Twitter story. Reddit makes money through ads, right? Like Reddit makes money through you going to their Reddit website. If they have free access to their API, they're not making money in that way at all, right? Um, so, what happens when they're seeing an increase in that API traffic, but they're not seeing an increase on their web traffic? Right? They've got to look at like what their monetization story actually is. Um, and so their first thought is let's shut off the free tier, right? Let's shut off that API access, and then we'll force people to pay, and then suddenly it's a revenue stream. But what's fascinating is that like you need to take a full kind of platform and ecosystem look at this, and for Twitter as well. The data that gets put into Reddit, into Twitter, help serve the content, help serve those ads that people are getting over the web experience. And so, what's really fascinating is to see that um, people are realizing APIs aren't a separate product in a lot of cases, but they are a distribution channel for the same product. And maybe you have a web distribution channel, you have an API distribution channel. And how we've monetized those historically have been very different. And so it'll be really interesting to see what goes forward. I mean, uh, Steve, you see what's going on with Reddit right
Oh yeah.
now, right? Like some of the things that are happening there.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So they are doing like a blackout, right? Do you know about the blackout? Them like moderators going away
Yeah.
and saying, "Hey, we're not going to do
Yeah,
this."
they're forcing them, and then some people are reopening and making it like not safe for work. So it's just like it's Their Twitter, I'm sorry, Reddit's just providing, just creating a lot of bad karma for themselves right now.
Right. So how do you not be a Reddit? I don't know. We'll see what Reddit does moving forward, right? But my advice to folks is to always think about that API as a distribution channel for a larger product. Even if like your entire distribution channel is going over APIs, eventually that will change. And I think a good example of this is like Stripe, where they have their API that is certainly their main distribution channel for value, but they have grown past that to say like there's actually like stuff that you can do on the web, and even though the web experience as a developer consumer has been phenomenal through them. And so like it's not, their entire business is not all API driven. It's more than that. API is a significant distribution channel, but it's all related to one bigger product. And I think if Reddit had thought like that to begin with, if Twitter had thought like that to begin with, we'd probably be in a different situation with these APIs.
Yep, definitely. All right, so those are some great experiences, Kevin. We are running at the top of the hour, so I wanted to thank Kevin so much for joining today's conversation. I want to thank everyone for your participation. This was certainly one of the liveliest chats, and we got a lot of great questions. We didn't get to them all. I apologize, but I can try following up with Kevin to follow up on some of those questions. If you want to find out more about Postman, all you need to do is visit postman.com. Now, if you're interested in learning more about API design and API design tech interviews, we've got a great set of resources if you go to educative.io/interview, which has a list of all of our interview related courses, especially in relation to like API design. If you're interested in bringing educative learning resources into your team and sharing it with your team and hopefully getting your boss to pay for it, visit educative.io/enterprise. After today's webinar, everyone is going to get an email with a link to the replay as well as a link to some additional resources. And I hope you got a lot out of this. And based on the feedback here, Kevin, I might need to drag you back for a subsequent webinar in the future. And for folks in the comments, please put in the chat in the comments about subsequent content that you and I hear about, and additional topics. We want to make sure that this stuff is helpful to you. So with that being said, wanted to say thanks again to everyone, including Kevin. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon. So thank you very much. If you enjoyed this video, help us out by liking and subscribing, and tell us in the comments if you want us to explore any other languages or topics. Come visit us at educative.io, where we have over 600 courses spanning programming languages, web development, data science, and system design and interview prep that provide pre-built dev environments that let you code directly in the browser so you don't have to configure anything. Thanks for listening, and maybe check out one of these videos next. Thanks.